Today on the Transplant Helper, we're going to be discussing one of the most exciting, one of the most thrilling, one of the greatest discussions we probably ever had on the program before, one that I've been looking forward to sharing with you for quite a while, and one that I know you're going to be as thrilled about as soon as you understand what it is, and that is the subject of post-transplant osteoporosis. Yeah, not exactly that exciting or thrilling, but I believe to be a necessary discussion, so go ahead and stay tuned. Hey folks, welcome to the Transplant Helper again today. My name is Jim Burrell, and yes, today we're discussing yet another one of those necessary topics, albeit not very exciting nor thrilling discussions, and that is the subject of post-transplant osteoporosis. Now, if you're like I am, it's probably one of those subjects, unless a close friend or family member suffers with such, you may not have even given it a lot of thought in the past. And I was basically in that same boat until about a week ago when my transplant coordinator picked up the phone and gave me a call and revealed to me the most recent results of my DEXA/bone density scan. And basically, in a nutshell, she told me, she said, Jim, you do not suffer with osteoporosis yet. However, you do suffer with a condition known as osteopenia, which means there has been a breakdown and there's continuing to be a breakdown in your bone density and your structure. And she went on to explain that that put me at a much higher risk in the future of developing osteoporosis if I was not cautious and careful about what lies ahead. Now, basically, immediately I asked her, how could this be? I don't have necessarily a pattern of this in my family. It's not necessarily something I'm inheriting genetically. How could this come up? And she explained to me, and it's why I wanted to share with you, that basically post-transplant patients, because we're on so many immunosuppressant/anti-rejection drugs, particularly on the devil's drug, better known as prednisone, aka that steroid, basically because we're on that, we're at a 60% plus higher risk of developing osteoporosis after transplant than the general public. And so I thought to myself, you know what? In any disease, with any condition, if there's a 60% higher risk given to us as transplant patients over the general population, that's a subject worth discussing. Now, with that said, let me explain just a little bit about osteoporosis, what it is, what it can potentially mean for us. In the first place, to basically define osteoporosis, and I understand most of you already understand this or know it, osteoporosis is a breaking down, a degeneration, or a thinning of the bone structure itself. And basically what that can lead to eventually is the potential for not only that kind of hunched over, humped over look that you see a lot of elderly or older senior people having, but more importantly, it potentially can lead us to a future of a lot of broken, cracked, chipped bones, that sort of thing. And you know as well as I do, once we get older, or at any age for that matter, but especially once we get older, breaking a bone, something like breaking a hip especially, can be very, very problematic and troubling, certainly something we don't want to have to deal with. So basically, anyone would want to avoid osteoporosis if possible, just to avoid the broken bone itself. Now, as I was digging around doing a little bit more research in this subject, I came across a lot of information I just thought would be worth sharing with you. And that is basically osteoporosis, if you back up, pre the 1980s, it had no definitive way of being diagnosed. Now, pre the 1980s, a doctor might tell you that you suffer from osteoporosis basically because you'd broken a bone. And particularly if you were older, if you fell from just a standing height, there was nothing involved, no real shove, no real trip. If you just fell and you broke a bone, you were to suffer of osteoporosis. In addition to that, maybe if they went in to do surgery and they had to try to put a screw into a bone, if they felt like that screw went in too easy, they assumed that bone was brittle, and they said you suffer with osteoporosis. Now, from the 1980s forward, as the DEXA scan or the bone density scanner was developed and began to be used a little bit more, they came up with a much more definitive way of describing what osteoporosis is, and even added the category that I'm in already, and that is the category of osteopenia, or the precursor to osteoporosis. Now, here's how that basically worked. They took this DEXA scanner, which is basically a fancy x-ray type scanner. They took that as they were developing in the 1980s and began to scan scores of people. As a matter of fact, they began to scan people from all ages, from children up to senior adults and such. And as they were scanning them, they noticed that the most likely people to break bones in that position or in that scan were going to be the elderly people. Of course, that had been documented for a long time. On the other side of that spectrum, a lot of times people who are breaking bones, particularly breaking arms, wrists, that sort of thing, were children. And they decided that on the one hand, for the elderly people, it was because of the decreased density of the bone, and on the children, it was because of the underdeveloped density of the bone. So these two ends of the spectrum developed. What they then learned is that in the middle of that, between childhood and senior citizenship, there was basically the 30-year-olds. And they decided that anyone in their 30s was the least likely group to break a bone. And so they decided, well, whatever we need to do is we run these people through this DEXA scanner. We need to get a baseline and say that whoever's in their 30s, their average bone density is going to be called the new average. And anyone who falls below that is basically going to be seen as being a sufferer of osteoporosis. And they put a curve in there, and I don't know all the ins and outs or all the numbers. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not trying to be. But they put that curve in there, and below the 30-year-olds, typically, of course, age doesn't always affect this, but anyone who fell below that curve by about negative 2.5%, those people were considered to have osteoporosis. And so they decided these are the least dense bones, these are the people with the most potential for breakage, and or ultimately we see the slumpage, the humpage, that sort of thing. But anyway, with all that said, they decided that something needed to be done to combat that. So they began to give out a lot of supplements. Particularly, they understood this was a decrease in the calcium levels. So they began to prescribe and do a lot of different people, especially elderly people, higher doses of calcium. So calcium supplements were added there. They also discovered at that same time that other minerals need to be added to the body in order to make the calcium stick. And in the main place, vitamin D is added to that. Now, most of your vitamin D comes in from the sunlight outside, but there could be additional supplements given, vitamin D, that will allow the calcium to bond and to strengthen the bones as it should. So they went through all this regimen, all these things. Then they came back in and said, okay, if these people in the 30s are registering here, these older people or those who are more than negative 2.5% are called osteoporosis sufferers. What are we going to call the people in the middle? People like I am, people like potentially you might be. And that is they call us those who suffer with osteopenia, which is basically anyone who has about a negative 1.5%. So from the baseline down to about negative 1.5% are considered to be the osteopenia sufferers. And then from that point down, that's osteoporosis. Now, again, what is it that we need to be doing as post-transplant patients? Well, because we're on the immunosuppressant, because we're on the anti-rejection drugs, again, particularly that steroid, corticosteroid, prednisone, the devil's drug, it's always a good idea that our transplant team prescribe unto us some sort of supplements, particularly calcium and vitamin D. Now, they may also choose to add to that magnesium. That's another important mineral. They may choose to add iron. They may choose to add a number of different things, but basically the calcium and the vitamin D supplements are added. And more than likely, if you're a post-transplant patient, you might notice if you pick up your medicine bag, mine's sitting over here, that you're going to find in that medicine bag those supplements. Maybe you probably never really thought why you're taking these. That's exactly why. But what they discovered with me is that in spite of the fact that I'm on 3 doses of calcium and vitamin D each day, up to, I think, 500 milligrams each time. In spite of that fact, in the 5-year period post-transplant, I have developed that degeneration of the bone, the thinning of the bone structure, and they called it osteopenia. So they've added to that. They can't necessarily go up on that anymore. If you get too much potassium, too much calcium, too much vitamin D, any of those, too much magnesium, too much anything in your body, too much overkill can be just as detrimental, but but they basically said you're already at the maximum dosage. So they said the best thing that I can do and you can do if you're a sufferer or a potential sufferer like we are as transplant patients is to do a lot of exercise, particularly exercise of the joints, exercises, weight-bearing type exercises. That's not necessarily bodybuilding or, getting out and squatting or bench pressing, but weight-bearing exercises are really good, especially for strengthening those joints or the ends of those bones as they come together. Because as the bones are put under stress, they basically get the idea. Your brain sends out the signal and the hormones to tell your bones, okay, you need to thicken up, you need to strengthen up, because you're dealing with a big old person here. You're dealing with a big guy or a big gal. Even though you might not necessarily be that, you've kind of got to fool your bones into thinking that you are, so it kicks into high gear and starts putting out and building as thick and as good of a structured, solid bone as it can. Now, it has to have the tools. It has to have the supplements, the vitamin D, has to have the calcium, has to have those things at its disposal. But while it's doing that, those strength, weight-bearing type exercises can help. Now, what does all this mean? The main point of this is just to let you know that if you're a post-transplant patient, your potential for one day developing osteoporosis is a 60% higher risk than the general public. And as you go in, like I almost did the other day, for these routine bone density / DEXA scans, know how important they are. I can't tell you how close I was the other day, albeit I didn't want to be non-compliant, to calling up and saying, look, I don't have time for no bone density scan. I don't even care about it. It's no big deal. I almost skipped the scan, and I'm glad I didn't, because this is one of the things I needed to know. So just go ahead. If you've not already had your DEXA / bone density scans, go ahead and check with your transplant coordinators, check with your team, see if they see that to be a necessary part of you and something you need to do. And if so, once you go in and have those scans, keep your ears open, your eyes looking forward to seeing what the results are, and then be ready to begin to do what you can to prevent this future. Because like she explained to me, you don't want to end up breaking a bone every 2 or 3 years and trying to live this life. And I certainly don't. Anyway, I don't know if this interests you in any way, but if it did, go ahead and give this video a big thumbs up. Maybe share it out with someone who might benefit from it. Maybe share it out with someone this might help. I appreciate your attention today. I appreciate you joining me. And until next time, please stay stronger, friends.